Hello, welcome to London, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I would like to welcome you on the behalf of Frances Segelman, the sculptor, and Yad Vashem UK. My name is Rosie Whitehouse, and I'm going to be presenting this event tonight. It was until a few moments ago an absolutely beautiful sunny afternoon here in London. But we're really in the heart of the capital. We're a stone's throw from Tower Bridge and from the Tower of London. And we're in Frances Segelman's garden because we have to abide by very strict COVID-19 regulations. And we're just outside her studio, which is packed with the most fantastic sculptures that she has created over the years. Now, Frances is known for her sculptures of celebrities and of the royal family. But in recent years, Frances has also begun a series of busts of Holocaust survivors. And we are here this evening to watch Frances sculpt Holocaust survivor, campaigner and educator Mala Tribich. Now I can see that we're being joined by people across the UK, and a very big welcome to you all. But I can also see that we have a number of people who are joining us from across the globe. So welcome to those of you who are joining from Belgium, from Israel and from the United States. And a very big welcome to those of you who are joining us from Sweden, because a little later on you will discover that Sweden played a really important role in Mala's life immediately after the liberation. Now, Frances is going to sculpt Mala in clay in 2 hours. To me, it seems extraordinary that you can create a work of art in 2 hours, but that's what we're going to see here this afternoon. But before the sculpting begins, I'll have a chance to introduce you to Frances and to Mala. Frances, you normally do this kind of sculpting event in front of a live audience. How is it going to be this evening in much more restricted circumstances?
Well, it's very strange for me. And as you know, the 2-hour thing is the pressure, and having hundreds of people has always worked so well with me for the 2 hours. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it still works, because it produces very good work, and I love the feel of it. So I'm looking forward to seeing the result.
Now, the two of you have already met because you sculpted Mala's brother, Ben Helfgott, a few years ago, a sculpture which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. But how do you actually prepare to do this, particularly in times of COVID where you can't get very close to Mala? How did you prepare for this evening?
Well, I did get some photographs of Mala, and I've been looking at them and sketching a little bit, reading about her. But I actually don't do much preparation for these things. I just go straight into it, and then the personality comes out.
And Mala, what was it like for you when you discovered that you had been invited to sit for Frances Segelman?
Well, it was actually very exciting. I didn't expect it. I didn't think, I knew that people were being sculpted and survivors, but I didn't think of it being done for me. So it was very exciting and very nice.
And I mean, it was a difficult time to suddenly discover you were going to be sculpted. We were in the middle of a lockdown. You couldn't get to the hairdressers. What was your immediate reaction?
Well, luckily the date is such that those restrictions hairdressers have come into work. So I was very lucky there. I don't know what you would have found otherwise, but I have managed without the hairdresser, and just, well, we all have, haven't we?
And it's a new role for you as artist model. Are you a little bit nervous?
A little bit, but I know Frances, and she's already made me feel so much at home and at ease, and she's just lovely, and I know that I'll enjoy it. People have said to me, so you just have to sit there for 2 hours? And I said, well, I'm looking forward to it. It really won't be a hardship. I'm sure I'll enjoy it, Frances, won't I?
Yes, you will.
And while we're going through the whole series of the films and the interviews that we're going to show this evening, we're going to have a constant little picture of the work in progress. And it might be just interesting, before you go and begin the sculpting, to explain to people exactly how you do it. So what are they going to be watching? They're going to see you with something called calipers. What are calipers?
Yes, they're the tool I measure their bust with. And so Mala's going to have to sit very quietly, and I'm going to have to ask her not to talk to me, which is awfully hard, and I don't like doing that to you, but then that's the way I produce the fast sculpture. And then I'm going to measure Mala's head back to my bust, and I'll keep doing that a lot until I get all the measurements right, then adding clay while I'm doing that.
And how long will it take us to see Mala's face to begin to emerge from the sculpture?
I think probably, oh dear, after about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. Yeah, so you'll see the profile, it'll look like her, and then I go round and round.
And Mala, are you going to find it difficult to sit still? I would be so nervous that I would be moving around too much.
I don't know, I haven't experienced it before, so no, I don't anticipate being bored. I'll be watching Frances.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let me wish you both all the best of luck.
Thank you very much.
And as you set off on this amazing evening.
Thank you, Rosie.
You'll be joining me here later on the sofa. Okay. And just say to everybody that if you want to ask questions of Frances and Mala, please put them in the chat box.
Yes, okay, lovely. See you
Okay,
then.
good luck.
Thank you.
Now, as Mala and Frances make their way over to the table where the sculpting will take place, it gives me a chance to show you another extraordinary piece of artwork that we have on display here this evening. It's a plaque which has been made by a friend of Frances, and it depicts Mala at the moment of her deportation from Poland to the Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. I think it's a very interesting piece of work. It's by Brian Parks, and I think that we can learn from looking at this sculpture the intense loneliness and isolation and fear that children felt during the Holocaust. And it's very important for us to remember that 1.5 million Jewish children lost their lives during the Holocaust. And there are many other children who continue to experience war in the world today who feel similar loneliness and vulnerability. So we're extremely grateful to Mr. Parks for donating this sculpture. As I said, Frances is going to create this sculpture of Mala in just 2 hours. It requires intense concentration, and during this time, Frances and Mala will not be able to talk to us. So last week I was extremely lucky that I was able to catch up with Frances here in her home and talk to her about her work. The first thing I wanted to ask you was that it's very extraordinary to start on a new career when you've got 2 small children. Why did you decide to start a new career at that point in your life?
I didn't actually know that it was a career at that time. I'd always done art all my life and come from a very artistic family. And when I started doing sculpture, when I think they were very young actually, and I lived in Elstree, I loved it so much I actually couldn't stop. So everything else was in the way, and all I wanted to do was do sculpture. And it was a passion, you know. It became a career much later on, but at first it was just a passion.
And sculpture is such a tactile thing. I can't imagine creating something so tactile with toddlers crawling all over you.
Well, it didn't really matter. You know, I would do it in the kitchen. I would sculpt anywhere, and it never bothered me at all. In fact, to be honest with you, I love having a lot of people around me. So I probably find it quite difficult if I was lonely and the house was quiet. So I'm very used to busy houses.
Now, what inspired you to take up sculpture?
That's a very difficult question to answer because I think it has to come from my father, who was a musician and composed music day and night all my life. He wasn't a professional musician, but he was incredible, you know. And my mother was an artist, also not professional. But so my whole world was art. And I think something had to come out of that, you know, and it just developed in me.
Now, you're well known for sculpting the royal family and sculpting celebrities. What made you decide that you wanted to sculpt Holocaust survivors?
It was Helen Frey from the Mackle Charitable Trust in Leeds, because I come from Leeds. She asked me if I would come to Leeds to sculpt Eric Hirsch in front of a group of people at the Ziff Centre in Leeds. And to be honest, I was really scared to do that. You know that I love doing sculptures in public, but this was a very different thing. But my father, after, you know, when I was born, after the war in Leeds, I wasn't allowed to speak to German people and on holiday. Everything was, you know, still very raw. And so I found that very sad, all that. So I pushed it all away, didn't want to know about the Holocaust. I didn't really want to know about all those things, never read any books on it. And so I thought this is going to be a very heavy chapter in my life going into this, but one of the most important ones really that I've done. So I'm very, very thrilled I started doing that. And it started with Eric Hirsch in Leeds.
Part of the drive comes from your own family background, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely.
And your family are Jewish, and what are their roots?
On my father's side, his grandfather came from Austria, brought the children over, his wife and his 3 sons and 1 daughter, over to Leeds. And when the boys became old enough, he opened a cinema for them in Leeds. And they went on to have a group of cinemas. And then when my father got married, he had a small cinema just outside Leeds as well. And on my mother's side, they're from Riga. My great-grandfather, he built a doll's house for my mother, which is in my studio, and I think about him so much. It makes me cry, actually. It's a beautiful thing. It's tatty and it's very old. My mother and her brother didn't look after it, and somehow or other I managed to get it in one piece, and it's a treasure, so I'm working in front of that.
So part of the process of sculpting the Holocaust survivors has also been a journey of discovery for you. What has that meant to you? It's
been incredible. I've had to, you know, go back into all the stories, the harrowing stories each survivor I've listened to. It's such a terrible depression you feel after hearing it. You can't believe that human beings could be treated so badly. You don't know where to put that feeling when you've heard it. You don't know what to do with the information. It's just, you can't help that person, you know, that's happened to them. And so my feeling, I think, is I feel that I'm doing something by doing the sculpture, especially after doing Ivor Pearl, because he did actually say, "Can I call you mother?" And I didn't understand what he meant. He said, "Because I feel as though you've given me a new life and that this will stay and I won't be finished. You know, that won't be, my life won't be finished completely." And that was a wonderful feeling. I felt as though I could give something to these people and their families. So I became quite hooked on that feeling, and I'm doing as many as I can.
And when you're preparing to do a sculpture, what do you do? Do you listen to their story in advance, or do you wait till you meet them and they tell you? And for example, before you did your very first sculpture of Eric Hirsch, did you sit down and listen to his testimony? Or?
No, nothing. I didn't want to. I just went straight into it. I thought I won't get there otherwise. I was really nervous about doing it because I wasn't sure how, because I'm very emotional really, and I wasn't sure how I'd cope with it all, you know. I've got to go into a room full of people and sculpt him. And so he took me into a room and we chatted for 15 minutes. And, you know, something comes out in the faces of the people I'm sculpting. I can't bring out all the things they've been through, but, you know, I've left something for their families, haven't I?
Yes, definitely. But not just for their families, because this is about it's about remembrance,
Yeah,
and also there's also an educational quality to the work that you do because it's on display in museums. How important is that to you?
It's very important for me to know that people are recognising the Holocaust, really, and the fact that it did happen, and that nobody in the world should be saying it didn't happen, you know, and all these people that are suffering and have suffered, it's their story, and actually we've recorded all their stories, the people I've sculpted, and we're going to have that displayed with them, so there'll be a sound to it and they'll be able to listen to the story.
And also, each story is so quintessentially different. Did you feel that with the person when you're sculpting them?
Well, they're talking to me about, you know, their lives. And yes, I mean, each person has been so incredibly different. Miriam, who was hidden away a lot, and then Freddie Noller, who was, a French resistance fighter, and such amazing characters.
And when you've only done one lady so far, Miriam, was it different to sculpt a woman Holocaust survivor from the men?
Well, I think Miriam's a one-off anyway, because she's become a great friend and she's full of personality. I don't feel it was much different, really, to be honest. You know, she sat so beautifully, and because I do this in 2 hours, so the person I'm sculpting has to be very still.
And did you find, I mean, you've sculpted the Queen. I mean, there can't be a bigger challenge than that. But do you find that there's a special connection between you and the survivors that you're sculpting? And have you maintained a relationship in a way that you haven't with some of your other models?
Oh, God, yes, absolutely. I mean, I feel like they're my family, definitely. There's a family feel. There's a bond with Jewish people. It's quite incredible, you know. I've never been terribly religious, but I was brought up in quite a religious way because my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandma was quite religious, and so I would be with her on a Saturday and Sunday and wasn't allowed to put the light on, and you know, we used to go to synagogue every Saturday. After my father died when he was 53, so I found a struggle to come to terms with that. It was really hard for me, and I wondered, you know, we will question God as such, and then when you're speaking to the survivors again, you know, you're wondering how these terrible things can happen. But when you hear them speaking, and they're not bitter, you don't have any bitterness, it's such an education to hear that, you know, they went through such hell, and yet they have remained in such a beautiful space, really, in their minds, and they're strong, and they want to enjoy their life, and they've got lots of energy. But saying that, I did actually sculpt Sam Dresner, who was the quietest of the survivors. I don't think he was very well at the time. Lovely, lovely person. And he was an artist, and sadly he's passed away.
So it must be, in a certain sense, sculpting a Holocaust survivor with your drive for remembrance and the affirmation of life must really channel these positive energies.
It is. It's a very powerful thing. I work really fast. I have to be positive all the way through. Every thought has to be positive. If I'm not positive, the sculpture's not turning out right. And so I need the pressure of the people there to keep me in tunnel vision. There's definitely thoughts going through my mind of what they've been through. And it was starting with Arik Hirsch and all of them. I've been thinking, how is this coming out? You know, how is this going to come out in the sculpture? And this person's been through so much.
Of course, you've sculpted Mala's brother, Ben Helfgott, and he's an extraordinary person because, like so many survivors, people of agency, but he also went on to become an Olympic champion. I mean, did you feel that strength within him?
I did, actually, and it was quite interesting. He was introduced to me through Simon Bentley from Yad Vashem, and I was asked if I would sculpt him. When it came to the actual sculpting of Ben, and his wife said to me, well, we came back from Israel, or New York, I think it was, yesterday. And I said, I don't know how she said, you have no idea how strong he is. You know, he is absolutely amazing. And it came across in the sculpture, yeah. I felt that he was like a mountain of a man there.
And also, I mean, it's very unusual to sculpt Holocaust survivors, but to sculpt Holocaust survivors' brother and sister.
Yeah, I mean, that is unbelievable and amazing they both survived.
Once you've finished the sculpture of Mala, are you going to move on to carry on in this series?
I intend to carry on sculpting the Holocaust survivors. I'm going to do Rachel Levy. That will be sculpted in Selig House as soon as we're able to go there.
Where are the sculptures currently on exhibition?
There are some in the National Holocaust Centre, Bergen-Belsen in Nottingham. And it is a most amazing centre, and it was started by the Smith family many years ago, a non-Jewish family. And they had this tremendous passion to have a museum there. They changed their house into a museum for the Holocaust. I met Marina Smith, and she's just one of the most beautiful people inside and out. She's a dream lady, and I was asked to sculpt her, so I went up to Nottingham quite a while ago and I sculpted her, and that sculpture is there as well.
You've worked with many charities. Where does that drive come from?
Well, the drive comes from the fact that when I started doing these events in the beginning, probably 30 years ago, I decided that it had to always be for a charity, and I felt that it was important to give something, and giving something back to society. So each time I sculpted somebody in public, that would be for a charity.
Do you think that the fact that you've sculpted so many celebrities is a really positive thing behind your Holocaust sculptures, because it brings in another audience to the Holocaust which wouldn't otherwise be there?
There's many, many more people would be taking notice of the work I'm doing for the Holocaust because of the work I've done before. And I think that is a very interesting point, yes.
And you mentioned the National Holocaust Centre, but the bust of Ben Helfgott is in the National Portrait Gallery.
Yes.
Would you like to have your busts in other places, for example, to reach audiences that might not see them otherwise? I mean, maybe at a football stadium or in other places where people can be reminded of the Holocaust just accidentally as they pass by.
Well, yes, that would be an interesting thing, but it has to be in the right setting where people are sensitive enough to respect it.
Hello, and let me welcome you back to the banks of the River Thames here in the heart of London. And I welcome you to Frances Segelman's garden on behalf of Frances and of Yad Vashem UK. I think many of you may have just joined us, so a warm welcome to you all. And I know that we have people tuning in from across the UK, but also from across the world. We have viewers in Israel, hello Israel, and in the United States, Belgium and Sweden. And we're here this evening to watch Frances sculpt Mala Tribich, who is a Holocaust survivor, an educator and a campaigner. And I will say, because I know Mala, that she is also, as Frances said, a person of tremendous agency. And I'm sure that you're all longing to get a really close-up look at the sculpture, because that's exactly what I want to do, and to see how it's progressing. You can see there that Frances is using these things which I've learned are called calipers, and they take the measurements of Mala's face, so the proportions are all correct. And I'll just remind you that Frances is going to create this piece of artwork in a phenomenal 2 hours. To me, it's a total amazement that you could even bake a cake in 2 hours, let alone create a piece of artwork like this. Now, as you can see watching Frances work, it requires intense concentration to create this piece of work, and neither Frances or Mala can talk to us until that work is completed. You will have an opportunity about 7:30 this evening where you can put questions to Mala and to Frances, and if you would like at any point to drop those into the chat box, please feel free, and at about 7:30 I will be able to ask them on your behalf. Now, as I just said, we can't actually talk to Mala while she's being sculpted, but I was extremely lucky to be able to visit Mala in the garden of her North London home earlier this week, where we began to talk about the story of her life.
Mala was born in Piotrków Trybunalski in 1930. Jews had lived in Piotrków, one of Poland's oldest cities, since the early 16th century and made up a quarter of the population. As Piotrków industrialised in the 19th century, it was Jewish families who established the city's first factories and most of the city's shops. Mala's father, Moshe Yaakov Helfgott, owned a flour mill. Mala's mother, Sarah Klein, was a modern and stylish woman. The couple had 3 children, Ben, Mala and Louisa. Mala was close to her cousin Idja, who was a year younger, and these precious pictures survive only because one of Mala's aunts had the foresight to take them with her when she was deported to a labour camp. The extended Helfgott-Klein family spent their holidays visiting their grandparents until in the summer of 1939 the Germans invaded Poland.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your childhood. First, can you tell me about your family and your family life?
Well, I'm the middle one of 3 children, with a younger sister, Lucia, and an older brother, Ben. And before the war, my life was very happy and, in a loving family. And there's really not an awful lot to say about it, because I did all the things that children of my age did. I went to school, I had friends. We had 3 families in the same town. I was born in Piotrków in Poland. And so I had, there were 3 families, but all the 3 were single children. But still we had cousins to play with and families to go to for some during the festive season. And life was just lovely, and little did we know what was to come.
And what was Piotrków like when you were a child?
It's a very old town. It's over 800 years old. It was there before America. The architecture was classical, and it was a very pretty town, lots of squares and gardens. And, well, we had one very lovely park. We mostly lived in flats because there weren't any houses in town. People in houses usually outside. And I remember during the summer holidays, we used to spend quite a lot of time with our grandparents, particularly on my mother's side, although her mother died when I was 5 years old. I just remember one sort of scene with her when we were sitting together. Played with cousins. I remember there was a famous river, Varta, running through Sherrads, which is where my grandfather lived then, with the youngest daughter who was running the home.
Let's take you back to the summer of 1939. Did you had any inkling that something was in the air, that there possibly could be a war? Had anybody mentioned it to you? Do you remember anything about that?
I didn't, actually. I dare say my brother did, because he was very inquisitive and he could already read. So he was reading the papers, and sometimes not even necessarily at home, but when he was going past the paper shop. I didn't know anything about it. But on hindsight, I remember, I didn't know it at the time, I remember people from Germany coming to live in our town. And sometimes they would have, I remember one lady who was trying to sell a beautiful doll, because the Germans were well known for toys. They made wonderful, they manufactured wonderful toys. And this was, I suppose, something she managed to bring with her because she had a young child, and that was one of the items she wanted to sell. But I mean, this is hindsight. I remember this woman trying to sell a doll, but at the time I didn't know why. I didn't know the situation in Germany.
Because, of course, Polish-born Jews were expelled from Germany.
Yes, I know that now, yeah.
And so what do you remember of the day that the war broke out?
Well, I remember that there was, it started with bombing, but there's one particular scene that I remember, and that was outside in the street, broken glass and bottles among the glass, and a sort of commotion. I didn't really know exactly what was. Well, we sort of knew, oh, there's a war starting. And I remember sitting in a sort of semi-basement in one of the, or someone lived there and had a shop in the front. You had to walk up to the shop. And that's where we took shelter. And I remember this man coming in who lived there. And he must have been wounded, because as he was walking, there was sort of blood on the floor. Sort of followed him. His leg was bleeding, but he was walking. And you know, I remember very little. Also, the fact that we decided to escape from the bombs and from not only the shelling, but thinking we didn't know how far they'll go and when we're going to be occupied. So we made our way to another town, a small town, very small town, much smaller than ours. And, well, we didn't actually decide to go there, but we were going east. We stopped in that town called Suleuf, and we met my uncle, my father's brother there, with his wife and child. And we stayed overnight, but that the next morning was a beautiful morning, and I remember that with the sun shining, and then suddenly bombing started. And it was so severe that the whole town, except for about 2 or 3 buildings, was demolished. There were a lot of wooden buildings as well. And we were in a brick-built sort of house, large house with a lot of other people, and that one was spared. I remember people wanted to run during the bombing, and my mother tried to discourage them at the door. And once the bombing stopped, we all got out and ran to the nearest forest. And then we made our way home again, back, because we thought, well, the Germans were catching up with us, and where were we going to run to?
And when did you begin to realise that as Jews you were in particular danger?
Well, I didn't realise that at first, but ours was actually the first ghetto in Poland. And it was started within 2 months of the war. So by the 1st of November, war started on 1st of September, 1939. By the 1st of November, we had already been forced out of our homes and into ghetto walls. So we were the first one. It was a prototype of what was to come, except that ultimately our ghetto wasn't as bad as some of the later ghettos. They were dreadful, but ours was bad enough, I assure you.
And did your parents explain to you what was going on? Did they advise you to be careful? What
no, they didn't, not in so many words, but we were so restricted once we were in the ghetto. They didn't tell us it's a war and there's fighting, and we just picked things up. And children do. It's incredible how much they learn without ever being told. So we could see what was going on around us, and we just listened to the adults. I don't know if they realized it or not. And we were very aware of what was going on, but I I think my brother was much more aware than I was.
And you had a particularly unique experience of being sent into hiding, didn't you?
Yes, well, that was much later. The life in the ghetto was really very, if I say precarious, it's not the right word, but it was dangerous. It was very tough. But we were coping with that, but then we heard that there was going to be a deportation, and only people with work permits were going to be left behind for their work, and all the rest that were going to be deported.
What did deportation actually mean to you? How much did you understand?
A deportation was the most horrific thing for everybody at that time in Poland under occupation. It meant that only people with work permits will be saved. The others were going to be deported, and we knew it was going to be to one of the death camps. It wasn't going to be a labor camp. And we knew it was either Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek. They were all death camps. People were dead within a few hours of arrival. And actually, the people from our town went to Treblinka. And people were in panic. They wanted to try and save themselves. But it was very difficult. It was possible, but it was could be expensive. It was very risky, and help wasn't really available, especially not officially. So my parents were introduced, together with my aunt and uncle, the Klein family. They were introduced to a man from Częstochowa, which was a town about an hour and a half from Piotrków, and it was on the German border, practically on the German border. And this man was not only Polish and Christian, but he was actually of German origin. And they enjoyed more, more freedom and more privileges than the Poles. So for that reason, he was even more expensive. He was doing it as a business. And this man came to meet my aunt and uncle and my parents. I remember he was smuggled into the ghetto. He collected the money in advance. And he said that he'll come back the following week to pick up me, and the week after to pick up my cousin. And my aunt actually pleaded with him that there's Ija, their daughter's only child. Would he take her first? But he said no. He wants to take me first, and it happened. And traveling was very dangerous and under false paper on a train where they were always looking for people. And the worst of it was that there was actually a reward for handing in Jews. So then some people made it into quite a lucrative business. So they were going around, anyone that looked slightly Jewish or whatever perception they had of that, they would turn them over, to the Gestapo. We arrived at our destination safely, and we're supposed to be from Warsaw, because one is more anonymous in a big town than a small town. We found ourselves in this quite a big house on the outskirts of Częstochowa with a middle-aged couple, and they were the in-laws of that man who lived round the corner with his wife. And they weren't exactly thrilled to have us, but they tolerated us. They didn't ill-treat us. But we were very vulnerable and very scared, and we were very homesick. And when there was a knock on the door, sometimes it was okay for us to mix. Other times they would sort of hide us very quickly into a wardrobe, under the bed, anywhere out of sight. And my cousin Ija, she was 10 and I was 11. And she missed her parents so much. She was so unhappy. And she wanted to go back. But she was told she can't because the deportations are still going on. When she told the man that her parents have very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding their valuables, he said okay. She said they'll take her in. So he said okay, and he took her back. I thought how lucky she was. I was still languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. And eventually it was time for me. Lots of things happened in between, but anyway, eventually the time came for me to go back. I was to meet my father in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with his brother and another man. Now he was lucky to have a job there. When we arrived, there was my father waiting for me, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein, Ija's father. He looked at us and he turned white. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I brought her back. I took her to your friends." He told him the name. And he said, "But she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground and pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And that's the end of the story, because nobody knows till this day what happened to Ija.
And then what happened to your own family?
My family, we were all in hiding. Well, not all. Ben had a working permit, my brother. And I was with this family, and my father, mother and sister were with 3 different families hidden during the deportations. Some were outside Piotrków, I don't know exactly where. And I was the first one to leave and the last one to come back. So we were back safely as a family, a whole family, but that was very unusual. The ghetto, which had, well, originally there were 15,000 Jews in Piotrków, but so many came to join us from other places that it rose to 28,000. And they all had jobs in 2 places. They were employed. One was a glass works and one a plywood manufacturing place. So we were really lucky, but alas, not for long, because they realized that a lot of people have returned and smuggled themselves into the ghetto, and they sort of turned a blind eye. But they called them the illegals. And when they thought everybody was back, they started rounding them up. They were taking them to the synagogue, which was now in a terrible state, very dilapidated. They used it for stables. And they were held there without any food or water, no sanitary provision, under terrible conditions. They were being guarded by soldiers, but not German soldiers. They were Ukrainian soldiers. And they were bored. They used to shoot through the windows and injure people or kill them. And they're just doing it to amuse themselves. On the 20th of December, 1942, they were taken out in groups of 50, walked to the local forest called Rakov. The first group found their communal grave ready waiting for them, and the others followed, and there were 520 people, well, over 500 anyway, and they were all killed in the most horrific way. And we knew exactly what happened because people watched and came to tell us. So that's how I lost my mother and sister.
And were you working as a slave labourer at the time? Did you have a work permit?
Not yet, no. No, I should have been with them. Because my father and brother had permits and they were at work actually. When they stormed in the room where I was with my mother and sister. And a lot of other people. It was a crowded room and there was a bed and I lay down on it or in it, I can't even remember. And my mother said to the man in charge, the policeman in charge, Jewish policeman, that I'm not well. And he said, that's all right, she can stay behind. They took everybody else. And my mother said, stay there. She kind of insisted that I stay behind. And that's how I survived that.
It's amazing that your mother had the presence of mind to save you at the vital moment. I think that's...
Yeah, but for that policeman who was well known, I know who it was. I mean, he was well known. He didn't have a top rank, but he had quite a high rank. And he had a terrible reputation. He came from a really good family, but because he got this position during the war, you know, in the police force, and he was sort of full of himself. He was only, I don't know, around the 20s. He was either under or over, but he had a bad reputation. He wasn't very nice to people. And yet he saved my life.
And you, at this point, were the oldest surviving female member of your family. And as a result, it was your job to look after your little cousin.
Yes, because after that, they rounded up my aunt on my father's side, Helfgott side of the family. And she was taken away screaming, who'll look after my child? It was down to me. I was 12. And Anne was 5. There was 7 years between us.
That's an extraordinary responsibility at the age of 12. And there's an extraordinary story of how you managed to actually save Anne from another deportation.
In quite a short space of time after the deportations, they finally were going to close the ghetto, and there were just 2 groups of workers who had their places in the factories. So they emptied the ghetto of all these illegal people, and they searched very, very carefully because people were in all sorts of places and hiding. And they took us outside the ghetto, near the gates, and we were standing in a long column. In the front, they were taking people away. Lorries were coming, loading people on and driving them off. And we were towards the end of that column. I looked to my right and I saw a German officer. I don't know what gave me the idea, but I walked up to him. And that in itself was very dangerous because I could have been shot walking out of the column. Maybe I was trying to escape, or it was very dangerous, but I obviously didn't think about that. I went up to him and said, I've been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Can I go back to them? And he looked really flabbergasted. And I don't know whether he was a little bit amused or whatever his thoughts were. He called over a policeman and said, take her back inside the ghetto. On the way, I said, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. And I said, but I can't go back without her. What am I going to do? I want to go back to my father. And I kept on arguing. I just wouldn't take no for an answer. After a little while, the policeman relented and said, well, quickly, take and go into the ghetto. And that was a real bit of luck, because I know where those people ended up, because there's a memorial for them in that same forest.
And so then you presumably went into hiding again, or what happened?
No, then I was officially allocated to the plywood manufacturing, a very big concern. But we were where also my father and brother were, but we were no longer a family, because men and women were in different barracks. It was an enormous area, and the men were at one and the women at the other. I was with the women and Anne, and I started work as a slave laborer at the age of 12. And Anne was very attached to me. She was terrified of losing me. That's because she couldn't go to work with me. She realized that, but because we worked shifts, there were always some women there who keep an eye on her. And so that's how we spent the next 18 months, over 18 months. And then we were deported to Ravensbrück.
And what were you working as a slave labourer while you were in Ravensbrück?
No, I actually didn't work in Ravensbrück, and certainly didn't. She was really a tiny little girl. But I didn't work. I don't know why, I don't know what they had in mind, but we weren't there very long when they decided to deport us again. But the most shocking thing of it was the arrival at Ravensbrück. Wherever we turned up, at each place we thought, well, this is dreadful, it can't get worse than that. But it just continued to get worse and worse. There's just no end to how bad it was becoming. Well, they took everything away from us, and we had to queue up and give our details, because they were meticulous at record keeping. Then we had to undress. They took our clothing away. They shaved our heads. We went through cold communal showers. And when we got out at the other end, they gave us the concentration camp garb, this striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we really could not recognize each other. It was such a shock to the system. We all looked exactly the same. And that had a terrible effect on us. And one of the things that it did to us was to make us lose hope. And without hope, there's no survival.
But having Anne must have given you hope and drive to go forward.
Well, not really. Anne to me was a responsibility, not hope. I had to always think, well, will they take her? I've got to, hide her, make sure that she doesn't somehow... Actually, on one occasion, she suddenly closed her eyes, fell back, and I thought she had died. And I was terrified, but she came to after a little while, not very long. I was so relieved. After that, we had very tiny rations, or half a slice of bread. I thought that if I have a piece of bread, I'll be able to save her life with it. It's such a basic food that we can't live without that. So I remember carrying it around with me. I had like a little Dorothy bag. I don't know what I had in it, really. Can't remember, the little hanky and a little comb, but we had no hair anymore. But I remember this because when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, and it's a story I don't tell at the time, I couldn't bear to tell it. I felt ashamed for the person who did it to me. But when we arrived in Belsen, they didn't have room for us. They were very overcrowded, and they put us up in a tent overnight. There was no room to lie down or even sit down, but I must have fallen asleep, but I did fall asleep. I don't know for how long, could have been only a few minutes or longer. And when I woke up, my little bundle was gone. Someone had stolen it. And I was so upset. My worldly possessions and my little piece of bread for Anne, keeping for Anne. But I didn't talk about it. For years, I never talked about it.
But also there's an aspect to the story of your time in Bergen-Belsen which is particularly interesting. About, you mentioned often that there was a doctor, a dentist, who actually saved your life, who was a very powerful woman.
When we got into the camp and ultimately were being led as a group to a barracks somewhere, and on the way I heard there's a children's home. So I quickly set out to find it with Anne. And we found these two women in their office, which was like a little tiny hut near the barracks. And they asked us a lot of questions. And when they finished, they said to me, well, we are also very overcrowded. But in any case, you are too old. I was by then 14. And I said, yes, okay, well, I understand, but will you take my cousin? And they said, oh, yes, they intended to take her, whatever happened. Anne wouldn't stay without me. She was so determined. She was so scared of losing me. But at that time, she refused to stay, no matter what they said and what I said. And in the end, they took us both in. Now, Dr. Bimko was actually a dentist. And she worked in the hospital, and she had access to Kramer, who was the camp commandant. So she had a little bit of influence, and she managed to get a barrack for the children. That was her part of looking after the children or protecting the children. Well, we were very, very lucky to get in there. I know we wouldn't have survived on the main camp, and even there we succumbed to typhus, which was rife in the camp.
And welcome back to the banks of the Thames in the heart of London. We're just a stone's throw from Tower Bridge and the Tower of London, and we're actually in Frances's garden because we have to work under very strict COVID-19 rules. And I would like to welcome you back on behalf of Frances and of Yad Vashem UK, and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us in the last half an hour. I know that we have people who have been tuning in from across the UK and around the world, so a very warm welcome to you all. Now, I'm sure, like me, you're desperate to get a really close-up look at Frances's work and to see how her sculpture of Mala is progressing. So let's take a real close-up look at the work. And you can see that Frances has been working really at breathtaking speed, but normally Frances does this in front of an audience of hundreds of people, and at this point in the evening the drinks being served, there's a gaggle of chatter in the background, and Frances has been complaining that here in the marquee it's all a little bit too quiet for her. So if you can just make a lot of noise at home and a lot of chit-chat to back up Frances, that would be great. Even though she can't hear you, I think she'd love to know that you're out there rooting for her. And the sculpture is really progressing. One of the things that Frances has said to me that she finds a real challenge when it comes to sculpting women is their haircuts, and that in fact it's much easier for her to sculpt men who seem to care less about their hair. So it will be interesting as the sculpture develops to see Frances sculpt Mala's hair. And for those of you who missed the film when I was talking to Frances about her work and what particular this series of busts of Holocaust survivors means to her, she mentioned that she loves the agency that comes from the survivors when she's sculpting them. And I think that we can see that in many of the busts she's already produced, one of which is incidentally of Mala's brother, Ben Helfgott. This isn't actually the first time that Frances has done a sculpture in the marquee here on the banks of the Thames, and I know last time it was very, very hot and that caused a problem. Well, we've got quite nice balmy evening here in London. It's a little bit overcast. It was very beautiful earlier on. To me, I think it's extraordinary that Mala has such patience to sit so still while this sculpting is happening. And she looks so serene while Frances is sculpting her. It's very difficult for us to think that in the spring of 1945, Mala was extremely ill with typhus in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and that at this point she thought that she might not actually survive the war. In the spring of 1945, the British Army were moving across Northern Europe, and eventually they arrived at the gates of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Now, one of the first British soldiers to enter the camp was a young 25-year-old Londoner called Leonard Burney. And we can see Leonard Burney here in his uniform. He's a very dashing young man, I must say. And I'm delighted now to be joined by Leonard Burney's son, John Wood. Hello, John. Thank you for joining us here. Where are you today, so everyone who's watching knows? We're just having a few sound issues. Let's see if we're going to be able to hear John. While we just sort out the sound issues, perhaps we'll just cut back to watching the sculpture in progress. And let me remind you that at about 7:30, the sculpture should be completed. And at that point, you'll be able to put any questions you want to ask Mala or Frances in the chat box, and I will ask them on your behalf. At the moment, we can't, of course, speak to Frances or to Mala because this work takes in tremendous concentration, and I think it's really taxing for Frances because she usually likes to have a crowd around her, and we're very quiet because of COVID regulations here in the tent today. And of course, at the moment, we don't exactly know where Mala's sculpture will be put on show, but many of the sculptures that Frances has done before are in the National Holocaust Museum, and the sculpture of Mala's brother, Ben Helfgott, is in the National Portrait Gallery. They're extremely important sculptures because they play a very important role not only in remembrance, and I would say also it's not just remembering what happened in the Holocaust, it's also recognizing the likenesses in people. When I was looking at the photographs which we showed earlier of Mala's mother, I was actually struck by how much Mala looked like her. And so when we have this bust that we can see alongside the story of Mala's life. We can recognise other people's faces in hers. And now I'm happy to welcome back John Wood. I'm sorry, John, there we had a little bit of a glitch. Let me just remind anybody that it was your father, Leonard Birney, maybe we have a chance to see his photograph again, who was one of the first soldiers to arrive at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He was just 25 years old. John, perhaps you could start telling us a little bit about your father. What was he like as a man?
Oh, well, he was a very intelligent man. He should have gone to Cambridge, but unfortunately the war got in the way. And after the war, he was very successful in business and was a really generous dad. And I loved him a bit. And his story about Belsen was quite stunning when I heard it first when I was 15. It was quite shocking, and I felt I had a responsibility to tell people about it. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Yes, well, first, I mean, let's imagine us back there where Mala is so sick. Typhus was rampant in the camp. What did your father witness when he arrived in Bergen-Belsen?
Well, I think it's safe if I read from the book. I wouldn't want to get any details wrong. And let me tell you exactly what he wrote on that exact subject. What he said was, Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, who was his officer, decided to enter the camp to investigate. Taylor, Kramer, was in charge of Belsen, and I, together with the intelligence officer, Lieutenant Singleton, who had arrived with his loud Taylor van, and 2 army photographers, drove into the camp. We drove the length of the camp and back. It was nearly half a mile long. Announcements were made in German and other languages that the British Army had arrived to take over the camp. The inmates were now safe, but had to stay where they were. As we drove along the camp's main road, we saw dead bodies lying beside the road, and many hundreds of emaciated men and women prisoners, still mostly behind barbed wire. We saw many long wooden huts with corpses littering the ground between them. In open areas at the rear of the huts, more piles of corpses. At the end of the road, we saw a large open mass grave containing hundreds of corpses. The sights, the stench, the sheer horror of the place was described. After fighting away from Normandy for the last 10 months, we were used to seeing battle casualties, but we had no warning of what we were about to see. I had never experienced anything remotely like it before. I remember being completely shattered. We did not go into any of the huts. That was a horror to come. So that's what he said about it.
And I think it's worth just saying at this point, for people who don't know that much about the story of Bergen-Belsen, is that many of the death marches which were carried out at the end of the war ended up in camps like Bergen-Belsen, which made them incredibly overcrowded. And there was an enormous problem with typhus in the camp, as we've already mentioned. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the other conditions in the camp, because I understand there was no water, was there?
That's right. When Dad arrived, the water supply had packed up a few days before. And there was no food either. So there were 60,000 people all starving and had no water. Conditions that were unimaginable. And actually Dad was given the task of getting the water supply going again and then getting food somehow. So if I may, I can read again exactly what Dad says about this. It's actually his words. So he says, after having organised the water supply, the next job I was given was to scour the countryside to find what food stocks there might be that we could requisition. We knew there was a German army barracks 2 miles up the road from the concentration camp. I found there a very large military barracks the German army had left several days prior. The barracks was a Panzer, that means tank in German, training school designed for 20,000 soldiers. There were dozens of two-storey dormitory buildings fully equipped with beds and bedding, dining halls and lecture rooms. There was a 200-bed hospital still with its staff and medical supplies. I found the food store of the barracks holding hundreds of tons of various foodstuffs, tinned meat, powdered milk, vegetables, sugar, cocoa, potatoes, and so forth. I also found there a large bakery capable of baking 40,000 loaves a day, complete with many tons of flour. The civilian staff was still there. On the way back to the concentration camp, I discovered in the nearby village of Belsen a sizable cooperative dairy that had been supplying the area with milk, butter, and cheese. I reported the food stock that I had found to major miles of military government, and also that the modern empty barracks was, in my opinion, ideal to be converted into a hospital and recuperation camp. He arranged with the officers of the Royal Artillery Regiment posted to the camp to immediately requisition the whole of the Panzer barracks together with its food stores and hospital, and also to requisition a dairy in the village of Belsen. So there are the facts.
I think it's worth saying here that, of course, that barracks became the Belsen-Honor displaced persons camp, and survivors would stay there for many, many years, some of them. But I think also, I think that people who are listening to us today might be interested in hearing that actually that Panzer barracks is very near the Lunenburg Heath, which is where the Panzers trained for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So in itself, it's also a very historic place, and it went on to be used by the British Army, didn't it, itself, until very recently.
One other thing I just wanted to say about the food that I found is that when he testified in the Belsen trials, and he was asked, can you think of any reason why Kramer didn't eat all this food to starve or to feed all these poor starving people? And the dad is on record saying, no conceivable reason.
Well, actually, that brings us to the next question I was going to ask you, because Belsen's quite unusual, isn't it? Because both the commandant and the SS officers were actually in the camp when your father arrived. What was his first interaction with them?
Again, he says in his book about that particular subject, he talks about the SS guards, and he says about 60 camp guards, about half of them women, with the camp commandant Joseph Kramer at the head, had lined up on the road outside the camp. This is the detail of when he arrived. They were members of the SS, the German internal security organization, responsible for, among other things, controlling the detention centers. We later learned that there had been some 300 SS personnel at the camp, but most had fled when they heard about the takeover raid the British were taking over. Kramer had some handover documents ready for Lieutenant Colonel Taylor to sign. He told us there were about 60,000 inmates in the camp, of whom he estimated some 10,000 were dead but unburied, and that the death rate was running at about 500 a day. He said that there had been no water or food in the camp for several days. Nearby, at the side of the road, were several hundred German soldiers with their rifles waiting for the order to move out. As agreed in the no-fire zone document, it was a weird situation. For months we had been in mortal combat with the German army, and here I was, surrounded by them, all fully armed, hoping that they would keep to the no-fire arrangement. Fortunately for me and others, the advance party, there were no incidents. So that's his experience of the very first moments at the camp.
And he later gave evidence at the trial, as you said. And one of the very important things was, as we've seen, that the survivors were transferred to the new Belsen-Honor DP camp, and the original Belsen camp was burned to the ground. Now, many survivors were brought to witness the burning of the huts. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Well, all I can tell you is what his dad told me, and all he said about it was that by the 19th of May, the last inmate had been evacuated to the barracks, the new DP camp, It was decided to burn the whole disease-ridden place down because it was so diseased and so dangerous. That was the only option. So they brought in army flamethrowers and they burnt down more than 100 huts. And it took 2 days actually. They started on the 19th of May and the last hut was torched by the 21st of May. And then a large notice was erected outside. It reads actually to the front cover of the book, and it says, everyone's seen the picture, I'm sure, but I'll just read it to you. It says, this is the site of the infamous Belsen concentration camp, liberated by the British in April 1945. 10,000 unburied dead found here. Another 13,000 died. All of them victims of the German New Order in Europe, and an example of Nazi culture.
And how long did your father actually spend in Belsen?
Oh, he was there till about July. That was a long time, from April to July. And then he was transferred to Schleswig-Holstein, the military government there.
Did any of the British troops fall sick with typhus? We know that Mala's brother, Ben, was liberated at the Theresienstadt ghetto by the Red Army, and many of the Red Army doctors and soldiers who cared for the survivors in Theresienstadt fell ill. Did any of the British soldiers fall ill?
Well, as far as I'm aware, what that told me, no. But he did get dysentery. A lot of them got dysentery. But that was also rife, which must have been awful, but they carried on working nonetheless, because they wanted to save as many lives as they possibly could.
Now, it's interesting here because your father didn't talk about what happened to him. Why do you think that was?
Oh, well, it was such a traumatic experience. I mean, many survivors and liberators never spoke about it at all their whole life. Too painful. Whenever they tried, they'd break down. So, but somehow Dad got out of that, and I remember it was actually the 1975 anniversary of the liberation in Hyde Park. He started telling me all about it, and I didn't know anything about it at all before. Previous to that, my mum tells me the early part of their marriage, it was a taboo subject. It was not to be discussed at all. But suddenly, he decided to tell me all about it. And then he spoke more and more about it. Then he started doing lectures. And then he appeared in two very important documentaries, Nightmare Fall, and also No Asylum, the untold chapter of Anne Frank's story. And so that's because he wanted people to know about what happened. He felt it was so important that people knew about it.
I also understand that he was prompted to speak out, largely because he was so shocked by Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. Is that correct?
Yeah, he said that what really annoyed him when he started reading that people actually started to deny the Holocaust existed or happened, and that really annoyed him, and that was one of the motivations to get him to tell the story. And then what that ended up as being was the book which was published, because originally it was just a Word document. People would ask him about it, so he sent people this document. And then one day he rang me up and said, "Shall we make my document into an actual published book?" And that's what we did. We got it published just in time for the 70th anniversary of liberation, 2015. And in it has a chapter denying the deniers. It annoyed him so much, he wanted to make sure that he made a statement against what they claim.
And let me just tell everybody who's watching, if you're interested in buying the book, I think that there's a link in the chat where you can click on and buy your own copy of the book. Now, John, this was a joint project with your father, and it turned you also into a Holocaust educator. And some of the work that you've been doing is really very cutting edge. We're going to see a clip now of some of the work that you've done. Now, all of us who have a Twitter account will recognise that that was, well, not exactly a fake Twitter account, but a special use of Holocaust education using social media, which is often, I'm sad to say, a place where we do encounter Holocaust deniers and fake news. What gave you the idea to use Twitter?
Oh, well, I can't claim anything for it. It was not my idea. I was approached by a brilliant filmmaker called Mark Morton one day, and he just said he wanted to make, he'd heard about my dad, and he wanted to make a film that would communicate to the young people. And I actually think it's amazing, because it does make it real for young people, because Twitter's so real, and it just makes you think he had Twitter back in those days. It's all very authentic and hard-hitting, and I would love it to be shown on TV. I think it deserves to be, and also used in schools.
Have you actually used it in school yourself? What's the reaction when you show this to people?
No, I haven't. It's only on YouTube. I haven't actually used it. What I have done in schools is play the documentary No Asylum, and that has been very effective too. But the thing is, it's a bit too graphic. The Twitter film is a bit too graphic, so I might have to get it re-edited to make it more acceptable, different age group.
I think so, and also similar tactics have been used on Instagram. There's Eva's Stories, which has been very, very successful. Just before we wrap this up, I'd really like to talk to you about the role of the Bergen-Belsen story in British history. How do you think this is going to be remembered?
Well, I think it's such an important part of what Britain did in World War II, showing what wonderful humanitarians they were. The fact that they were suddenly given this challenge. You've got 60,000 people, they're all dying, now you've got to save them without any warning. This is what Dad used to say. There you go, there's 6,000 people, what do you do? And the army hadn't trained people in that. But I think they did a wonderful job. What Mala's saying, they were wonderful. They did a great job, saved as many lives as possible. And I think I'm so proud of my dad and what he did and all the other men that were there. And I have a duty to make sure the story is told as long as I can.
And did your father return to Belsen?
I don't think he ever did, actually. No. It was a bit too painful for him. But he was always so supportive, and he was always behind me in anything I was doing. We were talking all the time about it. He was buying books about Belsen, and it mentioned in them and so on. And it was great to be so connected to somebody who was actually there. And that, as I said, that I feel I have a responsibility now, a duty to keep the story going.
Well, thank you.
I've become a Holocaust educator myself.
Thank you so much for joining us here this evening on this really special event. And just to remind everybody that, of course, Mala Tribich was liberated by the British Army and by your father at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. So it's been a real pleasure for me to speak to you, and I hope that the next time we speak we'll meet in person. So wish you all the well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an honour for me to be part of it.
And we'll be talking more about Holocaust education later, because Holocaust education plays a very important part in the work of Yad Vashem UK. And I would now like to introduce you to Simon Bentley, who is the chairman of Yad Vashem UK.
Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us, Yad Vashem UK, in this tribute to Mala Tribich MBE, Holocaust survivor, educator, and a very special lady. A warm welcome to you all. We're honoured to be in the studio of Frances Segelman, the renowned and incredibly talented sculptor. We have an established partnership with Frances, who did a live sculpting 3 years ago of Mala's brother, our president, Sir Ben Helfgott. The bronze sculpture she produced was accepted as a gift by the National Portrait Gallery and will be on permanent display there when it reopens. Mala was liberated by the British Army from Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. Today, Mala is an inspirational educator, teaching audiences of all ages about the dangers of unchecked anti-Semitism, race hatred and dehumanization. Mala feels that it is her duty to speak for all those who cannot speak for themselves, telling all who will listen about what happened during those dark days in Europe between 1941 and 1945. As those of you who have been with us since earlier this afternoon will know, this event is being presented by Rosie Whitehouse. Rosie is a historical researcher, journalist and author who has extensively documented the experience of Holocaust survivors in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. She has reported on remembrance efforts and assaults on Holocaust memory in Ukraine, Poland, Germany, Italy, and here in the UK. Her historical research and profiles of Holocaust survivors have been published widely, as well as her writing about British government policy towards victims after the Holocaust and contemporary British anti-Semitism. In February, we were joined by Rosie, who discussed her book, The People of the Beach, Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust. And as you will hear soon, she will be in conversation with our Holocaust educator, Helen Conn, about the annual Holocaust Teachers and Educators Seminar that we organise and sponsor every year at the International School of Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem in Israel, which Rosie has attended. A big thank you, Rosie, for all that you are doing for us here this evening. Over the next hour, we will continue to see Frances performing this honorary live sculpture of Mala. Frances is a member of the Royal British Society of Sculptors and is well known for her sculptures of royalty, including the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh of blessed memory, and the Prince of Wales, and many leading celebrities. A big thank you to all of Frances' team who have been sensational in the way that everything has been so professionally and expertly organised. For those of you who have been online with us for a while, you'll have seen the interview with John Wood, whose father, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Burney, was a British soldier who was the first British officer to liberate Bergen-Belsen. You will also have seen the commemorative plaque produced by the well-known sculptor Brian Parks, featuring Mala being taken from her home. Our big thanks to you, Brian, for this. Further treats to come include a short film based on Mala's post-war life, and Rosie interviewing Moshe Teller, an art therapist from Jewish Care who is currently working with Holocaust survivors, second generation, and their families. At about 7:30, when Frances will have finished sculpting, we will have a Q&A session with Mala and Frances to be led by Rosie, when you'll get the opportunity to ask Mala about her life in Poland before the war, her time in the ghetto, her frightening time in hiding, passing as a Christian child, and the horrific conditions she endured in Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen. Yad Vashem UK raises money to support and promote the vital work of Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centre. Here in the UK, we promote Holocaust education and awareness by sponsoring an annual seminar for UK teachers and informal educators from Jewish schools and institutions at the International School of Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem. Promoting Yad Vashem's educational philosophy through our unique travelling exhibitions, learning resources for schools, and through the use of Yad Vashem educators and public speakers. And we put names to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, encouraging remembrance and research around their stories through our Guardian of the Memory campaign and Bar Mitzvah and Bat Mitzvah twinning. You can see a lot more if you visit our website. All the help you can give us this evening will be gratefully received. Thank you all for joining Frances Segelman and Yad Vashem UK to honour Mala Tribich this evening.
Well, thank you, Simon, for your extremely kind words. And yes, it's true. I did attend the Yad Vashem teaching seminar in Jerusalem. And you might be quite surprised to hear that after Simon's just said that I work as a Holocaust researcher. And by the time I attended the course, I'd actually already written my book, The People on the Beach, Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust. And I think that that's what's so important about Yad Vashem's work in Holocaust education, is that just because you know something doesn't mean that you don't know how to explain it to somebody. And I am in a minute going to join the Holocaust educator Helen Kohn, who will be on the phone from Israel. But before we do that, I think that you'd love to go back, and so would I really, to have a look at how the sculpture is progressing, because while we were talking to John, Frances and Mala took a quick break, because you can just imagine how exhausting this whole process is. And here we can see how the sculpture is progressing. We're really beginning to see Mala's face come to life, and also, as I said before, that Frances finds it quite tricky sometimes to sculpt a lady's hair. Well, I don't think it looks like it's tricky, because she did the most amazing bust of the Queen. But you can really see the feminine touches coming into the face now. And of course, just to remind those of you who have joined us here, we're actually in Frances' garden on the banks of the River Thames in the centre of London. And a warm welcome to all of you who may have just joined us. I know that we've been joined by people across the UK, but also across the world. And we've got people who've been tuning in from Belgium, the United States, Israel and Sweden. And in a minute, we're actually, well, not in a minute, a few minutes, we will discover the important role that Sweden played in Mala's life after the liberation. And I think that you can really feel the silence in this marquee. And I know that Frances is finding it very difficult, because normally she sculpts at a live event in front of a large group of people who by this moment will be enjoying canapes and a drink. So it's a very different experience. But while we leave Frances to get on with her work, we're now going to go to join Helen Kohn, who is in Israel.
Rosie, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Hello, Helen. It's lovely to see you. Just so that everybody knows, we know that you're on your phone, and anybody who's used to Zooming these days knows that the internet can be a little bit dodgy. So if you go down, just reconnect with us as soon as you can. I wanted to start off by asking you how the COVID pandemic has actually impacted on your work as a Holocaust educator. Helen, can you hear me? It looks like we're having a little problem with Helen there. While we just check the line, let's go back across to see what Frances is doing and how the sculpture is coming together. We have a problem here because it requires such concentration from Frances that she can't speak to us during this sculpting process, and nor can Mala, who has to sit extremely still. And we're going back now to see if we can re-establish connection with Helen. Simon to talk to. I think all of us are used to the fact that Zoom has many challenges, and unfortunately we're having a problem connecting with Helen Con in Israel. But while we wait to see if we can solve the technical problems in connecting with Israel, I'm really delighted to actually have on the sofa in front of me Simon Bentley, who you just heard speaking. Simon, in place of Helen, could you explain to us a little bit about the educational work that Yad Vashem do?
Well, Yad Vashem itself does immense amount of educational work in the sense that the International School of Holocaust Studies literally teaches students from all over the world. Visitors from all over the world come and attend throughout the year in a huge program, and that program extends to Yad Vashem representation outside of Israel as well. In the UK, we are of course a very small version of that. We send teachers and educators on a week's course, or 8-day course actually, to the International School of Holocaust Studies, where the standard of education is fantastic, and it is to Holocaust educators. So of course they can go back with the benefit of that sort of input and then reflect that in the way they're teaching, split between primary and secondary schools, so account being taken of that. And we do that to Jewish schools and organisations in a cooperative agreement with HET, who do the same thing for non-Jewish schools and organisations in the UK, so we work closely with them. But our educational commitment is very wide. So we, for example, have Yad Vashem travelling exhibitions. We have 7 of them, and we have a number of each one of those, and they're all over the country being exhibited, and frankly there are another 3 that are coming through, so there will be 10 of these travelling exhibitions, and the effect is considerable, so across the country.
And how has the pandemic impacted on your reach and your ability to reach into schools in particular?
So from the point of view of travelling exhibitions, of course everything is ground to a halt because we haven't had what to stage and how to stage and so on. However, we've had a whole virtual lecture programme, so partly our book club, where we always used to meet physically in particular places, Keats House in Hampstead, or a variety of places, there would be maybe 20 people or 25 people. Now we do them virtually, and of course you get 85 registering and 63, whatever it really is, actually attending, or at least computers linked, as it were. In relation to other lectures we have done, which has been for a worldwide audience organised through Yad Vashem, there we've had many hundreds of people watching, with people like Professor Yehuda Bauer, who's one of the senior Holocaust historians and educators in the world, frankly, the whole programme. So we've adapted ourselves, frankly, as so many others have had to a degree positively, but of course we all can't wait until we can get back to closer to our previous norm.
And of course, Holocaust education doesn't just happen in the classroom, it's a holistic event, and that's partly what this tremendous sculpture is going to contribute to. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Frances and how you've been working with her.
The answer to that last part of the question is very simple. I have a wonderful co-trustee, Jeff Malamet, who introduced me to Frances. Frances agreed with the idea of a sculpture being done of Mala's brother, Sir Ben Helfgott. On the night he was sculpted, he was Ben Helfgott, and 2 days later he became Sir Ben Helfgott. I don't think we had anything to do with that, but nevertheless. And of course it was a wonderful event where something like 200 people were in the Hellenic Centre, where Frances sculpted live, modelling the clay live and so on, with a art on exhibit, a travelling exhibition on exhibit, etc., and speakers. What we're doing here is, as you've said, as a result of the restrictions imposed on us in this pandemic. But the effect, without question, it is so different. It is not just another of what are effective manners of trying to get the message across. This is so different, and it's lasting. And for the survivors, it puts them in the correct position of honour, as it should do. And for Frances, she is sculpting live. She is feeling the personality of the person who she is creating the form of, and as everyone knows and sees, the work is fantastic. So it's a privilege being here, and it's a privilege having her as our partner in this work.
Also it's a privilege to have Mala here. You know Mala well. Tell us a little bit about her.
Mala is genuinely beyond belief, to a degree, for all the reasons we all can try and understand, but we'll never really be able to understand in terms of what she's been through. But at her age, to have her diction and her brain in terms of the way, well, you know it firsthand because you've interviewed her recently, and when I watched it immediately afterwards, fantastic. So yes, she is a Holocaust educator, like very few others, I'm sure, who carries out that task of trying to educate the world, because these things may not be in precisely the same form, but they do happen again, because genocides have taken place, and we human beings apparently don't ever learn the lessons of history. So we can just do our most to not only memorialise but educate the world as to what can happen and to try and prevent it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here this evening, and I'm sorry to say I think we've lost the line to Israel, but everybody who's ever been on a Zoom will know that this is an ongoing problem in the pandemic, and thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. Now we can go back to take a really close look at Frances at work, and we can see the sculpture coming together. And for those of you who missed my interview with Frances earlier on, Frances was saying that she really feels that energy coming out of the Holocaust survivors while she sculpts them, and that they are people of tremendous agency. And until now, we've just been talking about the Holocaust itself. And a lot of people tend to end stories at this point. They tend to think, oh, well, you were liberated. That's the end of your problem, and that. But of course, once the liberation had happened, the real process of survival began, the real struggle, and I think that that's where we see the real agency in the survivors. And I was, as we know, lucky to meet with Mala in the garden of her North London home, where I talked first to her about her early life and her experiences in the Holocaust, but then I also talked to her about her life after the liberation.
After the liberation, aid workers estimated that only 5,000 Jewish children had survived the war, and the Allied and neutral countries offered to take 1,000 orphaned Jewish children each. From Belsen, groups of children were taken to Switzerland, the Palestine Mandate, and a handful came to the UK. Mala and Anne were taken to Sweden in July 1945. Mala was cared for in a large country house in the north of Sweden. As it was summer, it felt like they were on holiday, and the children spent their time swimming in the lakes and walking in the forest. And in winter, Mala learned to ski.
What do you remember of the actual moment of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen?
Well, I do have a particular scene that I remember, because I was actually still ill with typhus, although I think I had got over the crisis, that I was starting to recover. That is without medicine or anything, or not even clean water. And I remember lying on my bunk, upper bunk by the window, and I must have come back into consciousness because suddenly I was looking out and I could see people. I was actually lying there. I wasn't sitting up, but I could see people running. And what intrigued me was I didn't know where they were running or why, but I wondered how have they got the strength to run. And that was the 15th of April 1945 when we were liberated by the British Army.
And what was your first encounter with a British soldier?
I know that I was there still in the same bunk for 2 days. Within 2 days they came to collect me, and they came with a stretcher, 2 soldiers with a stretcher, and I said to them, "No, that's all right, I'll walk." And of course I got out and promptly collapsed. And they gathered me up, put me onto the stretcher and took me to the hospital. It took a little while to get me back on my feet, but then my recovery was very fast.
Then obviously for many people it was the question of what to do next. Did it ever cross your mind that you might go back to Piotrków?
It was I think we were all in a state of confusion. We didn't know who survived. We didn't know what we were going to do. And I was 14 at liberation, and I don't think that I had any ideas about what to do or how to do it. I feel now, and this is hindsight, of course, I didn't realize it at the time, that I was lucky to be the age that I was, because I couldn't make decisions. Not that I couldn't, perhaps I could. If someone gave me a choice, I could make a decision. But I wasn't making any decisions because everything was decided for me. And the most wonderful thing about it is that all the decisions were the right decisions, because whatever I did was right for me.
You were then sent to Sweden. How much choice did you have in where you went?
There was no choice. They said, "You're going to Sweden." And Sweden seemed like a very good opportunity to go to a nice country and live a good life.
And what did happen to you when you arrived in Sweden?
Well, it was in July that we went, but I remember it was wonderful. We didn't really dwell, "Oh, look what happened to us, where's our family?" But for the moment, we were just enjoying that freedom and food, wonderful food in Sweden. I became double the size in no time at all. There were other people like myself, and we were youngsters, and they were lovely friends, and I have very happy memories of Sweden.
And of course you were still with your cousin Anne.
Yes, that's very significant, because when this situation presented itself, where you can't put a 7-year-old with a 14-year-old in the same school, and Anne just happily went with her age group. I mean, I don't remember when we actually parted, whether we said bye-bye, or I can't remember anything about that. But I know that she went to a different school and we were corresponding.
You must have felt a huge sense of loss suddenly when Anne was no longer, your responsibility, but also your companion.
Yeah, well, it wasn't, I wasn't upset about it. I wasn't sorry. I felt a sort of sense of freedom, shedding responsibility. That's quite important. But don't forget, I didn't think in those terms because there was so much else going on in my life. New people who survived, or meeting perhaps old friends that didn't know survived, who got by chance.
Well, your brother Ben was liberated in the Theresienstadt ghetto and came to the UK as part of a scheme set up by the Central British Fund. And you also joined that scheme, didn't you?
Yes, the same people brought me over, that brought that group over, but of course I came over by myself as an individual to be reunited with Ben.
And what year was that you arrived in Britain?
It was 1947. It was the 24th of March, 1947. And they said, we had the worst winter ever. There was so much snow and it was so cold. And I looked at them and I thought, well, where I was, I had more snow because we were in the north of Sweden. And of course, we used to go out every day either on sleighs, we used to go skiing just up any hill, and we lived with sort of that kind of weather all the time, well, in the winter.
Was your brother there at the dockside to greet you?
Oh, yes, he came. He turned up with a friend who came from our hometown. It was a very happy reunion. I had been corresponding with Ben for over a year. There were lots of letters going there and back. So we got to know one another, and he was sending me presents, photographs, and I was sending him lots of photographs. And we had already established this reunion that we ultimately had. He had a sort of small group that were really close friends. And that whole group sort of took me in as if I was their own sister.
But the biggest challenge must have been the fact that, I presume, you didn't speak a word of English when you arrived.
Well, I thought I did, but I soon found out I didn't, because we learned, among other languages, we did learn English in Sweden.
Were you keen to get an education, or what was the driving force at that point? Was it to get a job, or...?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the first priority was to learn the language. And I did that very quickly in a very short time because, not because I'm good at it, but because it was necessary. And then I went to a secretarial school. This was my choice, and this organization, Central British Fund, agreed with it. They said, yes, that's fine, but of course you won't be able to do the full course like 2 or 3 years. So I only had 1 year, just under 1 year. I started work within a year. I was working.
And where were you living at this point?
I was living in lodgings in Maida Vale at first. I was working within the year, and then I met my husband-to-be a couple of years later, perhaps in the last year of my being single. And I got married in 1950. We got married in 1950. But I found the English very, very nice and friendly. My English part really started with my marriage, because my husband's family were all English, and his mother was born here, not his father, but he was born in Krakow, but then it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that he used to talk about.
And you went on to have 2 children. Was it difficult explaining to them what had happened to you and what had happened to your family?
No, I didn't explain to them. We didn't talk about it.
And so how did they come to learn your story?
Well, they were quite knowledgeable, it turned out, because children have their ways of learning things. We talked about it if it came into the conversation, if it was appropriate, but it wasn't something that sort of overshadowed our normal life. We never made a big thing of it in the family. And there was never that sort of shadow there. I mean, for me it was, but I could cope with it because I had my family around me, and I was doing all the things everybody else was doing.
Also, exceptionally, you went to university and got a degree, which is a really extraordinary achievement after not having had an education for so many years.
Yeah, I only regret I didn't do anything with it when I got it. I just very casually decided that I really lacked a lot of education. I had missed so much. But I wasn't going around with that thought, well, I've missed so much in my life and I must make up for it. It wasn't like that. I suppose looking back, I did do quite a bit, but at the time it didn't seem anything so special or unusual. Lots of people were taking classes.
And when did you start speaking in public about your experiences?
There was a reunion in Israel of survivors from all over the world. It was in 1981, which was apparently 36 years after the war. Does that make sense? It was an enormous reunion. I belonged to the Zionist Society, small group. And one of my friends said, when you're there, take notes. When you come back, we want to hear about it. And I did. And when we came back, they persuaded me that I should talk. And they actually had the foresight to get a room, not in somebody's lounge, but it wasn't a big hall. But it was like a small hall. And ever so many people turned up. I was so surprised. I thought, well, no one really wanted to know about the Holocaust that much. One of them said to me, you know, Mala, I've known you for so long, but I've never heard your story. And I said, well, you're not going to hear it today because I'm not going to speak about myself. I'm going to speak about the reunion. But inevitably, you know, people ask you and it creeps in. And my daughter's known to have said, well, I have to come to a meeting like this to hear my mother's story. But never, she didn't probably really know my full story, but she knew about the Holocaust. She was reading about the Holocaust. Because I just do it. I don't think about why. Well, I do think about why I do it. First of all, it's because I consider it very important. There's a lot to be learned from the Holocaust. And also it demonstrates what can happen when a civilization breaks down. And, well, particularly anti-Semitism, racism, discrimination, and what it does to people. But one, perhaps the overriding reason is that it is one of remembrance, because so many people, Jewish people, were annihilated. I mean, others as well. I'm very well aware that the Holocaust was only a Jewish thing, but it's much wider than that. But for the Jews, the numbers were so high, and in some cases, whole families were lost, were killed, and sometimes even their neighbors, and the whole town in some cases. And there's actually nobody in the world that knew them, because all the people that knew them went with them. And if we don't remember them, they'll be totally forgotten. It will be as if they had never existed. That, well, in the Jewish religion, it is remembering our departed is very important. There's the Kaddish, there's the lighting the candle, and there'll be nothing like that for them. So I feel it my duty that they should be remembered, and this is why I talk about it.
Very powerful words there from Mala, and perhaps the most important thing that's been said this evening, because it is true that many, many people were murdered in the Holocaust, and we have no record of their names, and particularly of the children, we have no photographs of them that exist. And a very moving thing that Mala said to me was that she doesn't have pictures of her little sister, and her brother Ben returned to Poland and was able to obtain her birth certificate, and that's the only evidence that they have that she ever existed. I found that extremely moving. And we will in a minute be talking more about remembrance and looking to the future as to how the Holocaust will be remembered. But I know that many of you, just like me, are really keen to see in close up how the sculpture is going. So if we can just go across to Frances and Mala for a moment and take a look at the sculpture. It's really coming now, and within half an hour you'll have a chance to put your questions to Frances and Mala, and if you would like me to ask a question on your behalf, please drop your question into the chat box, and I will be speaking to both Frances and Mala in roughly half an hour when I think that the sculpture will be finished. As I mentioned, the work of Yad Vashem UK is not just about education, it's about remembering. And I'm now joined by the art therapist Moshe Teller.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important and significant event.
We're delighted to have you, Moshe, and you've been working with Holocaust survivors and their families for many years. We're carrying out this event in very restricted COVID-19 regulations. How has the pandemic impacted on survivors in particular?
Well, it has brought just to say to the IT person, I can hear myself talking all the time. And it sort of creates a funny dissonance. I don't know if I can speak, but I can hear myself too.
Let's just pause a moment and go back to the sculpture, and let's see if we can sort out this sound problem. Any of you who've ever been on a Zoom will have experienced this. And here we can see that Frances has just worked at such breathtaking speed. I really wish that I could write a book in 2 hours. That would really improve my productivity. It's extraordinary to watch her. Just to apologise to you that we're having a few sound issues with the interview with Moshe Teller, but we will be joining Moshe again, hopefully, in a few minutes. Moshe, let's hope that we can welcome you back to this important event. I hope that you'll be able to speak without hearing your voice echoing in your head, which is an unpleasant experience. As I was saying, you're an art therapist and you have been working with Holocaust survivors and their families for many decades. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on survivors in particular?
Well, as we all know, we are all going through very difficult times. When we consider the survivors, unfortunately for many, it has brought up to the surface unwanted memories of their childhood. For instance, the invisible enemy that kills people randomly, i.e. COVID. The idea of not having to go through this again, as if to say, have I not suffered enough? Why now do I have to go through this experience again? It's quite daunting for many to experience that idea of this invisible enemy that kills everybody, not just the Jews, of course. We are also talking about the friend that until yesterday was a friend who was fine, but today he can potentially kill you. Forgive me for using such a strong language, but it's to illustrate the point that when people experience that idea of the friend, as I said before, now suddenly that friend could carry something that could kill me. How can I be able to trust anyone? That brings back the idea of betrayal of trust by friends and neighbors during the Nazi period, anti-Semitism, for instance, even today. Talking about also the idea of being locked between four walls. The incarceration under Moscow regime comes into mind.
And how has
supply.
the COVID pandemic actually impacted on the way that you've been working with survivors?
It has increased the telephone calls and the intensity of the telephone calls that I made to people. Whereas before it may have been once every so often, now it's become even a greater need for people to talk because they have nobody, in some cases, to talk to. In the best cases, of course, there are families around, but the fact that they are locked inside the house because of their vulnerability, the idea of having a person to talk to on a regular basis, who is not family, but able to hopefully listen well enough and give that emotional support, emotional holding, has become vitally important. So the idea of doing that has increased tenfold.
As I said, you're an art therapist, and art therapy was used widely in the displaced persons camps and particularly in the rehabilitation of child Holocaust survivors. Has art retained an important role in therapy, or has it been replaced by other things?
It's an extremely important aspect of people's life. We live creatively. And the idea of creating something, as it were, out of nothing, is something that is exceptionally important, because what happens is, like we are, as we speak, we're seeing Frances, the artist, creating a bust of Mala. What is she doing? She's not just creating a piece of art, she's creating memory. That memory is going to be there forever. Is creating a mark. That mark cannot be ignored or cannot be dismissed. People are going to ask, who's that person? What happened to that person? So as we speak, she's creating that memory. As I mentioned before when we had previous talk, the idea of creating an image creates not just the image of the wanted or unwanted object, but also create an idea that people can relate to. Not only can it bring back memories, but they can also be somewhat in control. I said that, for instance, whilst on the one hand you can create an image that is overwhelmingly difficult to bear, but at the same time you also have gained control over it. In other words, you created something, you can put it back in the drawer, but when you take it out, it is your choice. It's not going to be forgotten, but you created evidence.
And I think it's interesting to say here that your parents were Holocaust survivors. I'm correct in thinking that, am I?
Yes, to be precise, my father was a Holocaust survivor. He was from Hungary. He survived various camps, like many, including Mala, I suppose. He was lucky. He managed to lie his age. He looked a bit older than he was really, because as we know, most of the children, if not all under the age of 13, were murdered. And he too was a person who had his own secrets, which he never shared with any of us.
And this is really an issue when it comes to memory and remembering within families, is that when you realise that your parent has gone but they've never spoken about their experiences, you're left to wonder, to look for traits in your own children of grandparents that you don't even know, and sometimes even their names. How are you dealing with this in therapy these days?
I suppose that one way of dealing with it is by way of, it is interesting because people, first of all, the people I see, they know that I'm a second generation. So it gives me, as it were, a ticket into the life that may have had as a second generation, as a so-called professional second generation. They are in an environment which allows them to tell me things, stories that they would never dare telling their own children because I'm a professional. But what they are doing, they are telling me that which they cannot tell their own children. And we all know, as you well know, of course, and those who are participating, many of them have given interviews, have written books, and so on and so forth. One way of approaching the difficult subject, as and when is required, if people want to, of course, is not by asking them, Dad, Mom, tell me about what happened, but tell me about the book. We are using a third object to refer to. So when you talk about the book, we all know it's about you, but we're talking about the book. It is easier to refer to something that has been written or said, rather than creating or making the story again and telling us what has happened, what had happened.
And one of the real issues when this arises is actually the fear that you're actually treading on your loved one's toes, that you're going to frighten them and go into areas that they don't want you to go, because naturally as a parent they want to protect you. How do you deal with those issues?
Okay, so what you're referring to is the conspiracy of silence, as it's been coined. The idea that I cannot tell you about my story because I don't want to hurt you. Conversely, the child would not ask because they don't want to hurt them, and then they might leave an open wound. I can speak of a particular individual who has asked me to illustrate her book. And there were times where we sort of therapeutically argue as to why should I do this for you when you can do it so well for yourself? In times I came to realize that the idea of creating images that she wanted me to create was metaphorically, kind of in a metaphorical fashion, is to take me to the camps. So she is taking me by the hands, she's creating the images that she wanted me to create. And I had to follow exactly as she saw fit. So when how did I know we arrived when she told me it was exactly like that? It didn't matter that it was exactly like that or not to anyone, but to her, it was exactly like that. So I knew that we arrived.
One of the things that worries me sometimes in the work that I do is that it's almost as if this memory is becoming selective, that certain aspects of the Holocaust are remembered while others aren't. And I've recently been researching the deportation of the 4,000 children from Paris. It's a forgotten story. How do you deal with this?
Well, memory is very personal. And we must also take in consideration that the memory of a child may not be necessarily the memory of an adult. The memory does change and evolve. One of the issues that we experienced in the past is that there was a conference many years ago in London about remembering for the future. And it was a debate between two groups, the first generation and the historians. And the question was, who are you writing history for? Are you writing it for us? Or are you writing it for them? If you write it for the historians, it's okay to say that in 1944, in 1943, or 1942, the sort of there were taking events at a certain time of the day, at a certain hour, or that things have happened according to a certain sort of times and dates. But if you ask me about my experience, did I have concept of time? If you want to write about me, I'd like you to write about fear, death. Did I know that it was 4:30 in the morning when I stood up bare feet in the camp, so 4:32? Did it matter? Let's talk about that which is so primal, the kind of the fear of surviving perhaps the next moment. That is when you write about me. So when you write about the experience of the Holocaust, it has to be personalized, bespoke story. Because as you know very well, as we all know, those stories are so personal. And every person is a different group. And the idea of touching that, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that is, well, a question that people constantly ask is, what will future generations remember of the Holocaust? I think there's a lot of fear among survivors and in the wider community, actually, that the story will be forgotten. Do you think that there's actually a danger of this?
There is danger of that simply because we know already there are studies suggesting that sort of the generations, the younger generations, are less and less interested in what had happened to them. And as in our previous talks, I said that, you know, the tendency to talk about the Holocaust, they tend to talk about them and us. It happened to them. Well, the fact of the matter is, it happened to all of us. And if we are putting ourselves in the same quotation, we are then likely to understand the immense impact that has had on humanity as a whole, not least, of course, the Jewish community, and how we actually can take it further. There are the sort of different activities, such as the so-called Zikaron Basalon, which I've mentioned before, and that is the memory in the living room, whereby it's a meeting that takes place during the Holocaust Memorial Day, and you invite people into people's, of course it has to be organized, but you invite people into their living room, and you ask a couple of people or more, doesn't have to be first generation, it can be second generation, including third generation, to talk about their story. Why do we do that? We do that because we invite then the opportunity for people to contribute from their own experience. And do we find out how important that is? Yes, we do. People who have never been able to ask questions because of, if you like, the fear of hurting, as you mentioned before, I suddenly find themselves in an environment where there are lots of people who are there who they feel somehow protected to ask questions that before they found difficult.
And how do you think
when it talks about,
I was going to say,
so,
how do you just in the last couple of minutes, how do you think it's going to be remembered by Jewish people? I mean, is it going to become like Passover or Purim, or how will this be in 1,000 years when we talk about the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we need to remind ourselves is that when we think about our Jewish holidays and when we celebrate, what are we celebrating? We are celebrating those who try to get rid of us. It's important to remember that. And one can celebrate it in any way, shape, and form they want. But the idea of other people wanting to get rid of us because we are different, it's something that applies to all of us. We now celebrate it because we are celebrating the fact that we managed to survive despite all odds. You and I are talking now. We will not be able to do it otherwise. It is interesting, and I want to just a little anecdote. When I visited Prague quite a number of times. the Jewish quarter that has been kept in such a way that Prague is beautiful for those who have been there. One of the reasons why the Jewish quarter has been kept to that level so beautiful is because Hitler ordered his troops to keep it because he wanted to create the Museum of the Extinct. This is how powerful it is. They wanted to get rid not just of the Jewish people, but of our cities. And when we talk about memory, what is important to remember is that why we want to remember. What is the purpose of remembering? Is it just for the sake of remembering, or we need to do something with the memory? Do we need to be passive or active in the memory? Yes, we need to be active in the memory.
Moshe, that's a very powerful point to end on, and personally I could listen to you talk all evening. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for joining us this evening and adding such gravitas to our understanding of remembrance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my passion.
Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
And now comes the really exciting part of the evening, because Frances has almost finished her sculpture of Mala, and in a few minutes she will be joining me and on the sofa, and it will be a chance for you to ask questions of both Frances and Mala. If you've got any last minute questions, please do send them into the chat box and I can ask them on your behalf when they join us on the sofa. But I think now everyone is really excited to take a close-up look at Frances's work. So let's take a minute to really appreciate what she has created. And it's really incredible to think that just over 2.5 hours ago, when we started our broadcast here from the banks of the Thames, that the sculpture didn't exist. And it's really extraordinary to see Mala brought to life in clay. And eventually this will turn into a bronze statue. And I can only imagine how exhausted both Frances and Mala must be at this point, because it's been a very intense experience, and they haven't been able to speak to us. So I'm really looking forward to having them come and join me here on the sofa in a few minutes.
Really, at 29 minutes past, we're going to do images from the whole day. So if you want to introduce them, I'll give you a cue. From here, there's been photos taken behind. Just
And I think we really all need to thank Frances for hosting us here in her garden on the banks of the River Thames. It's a beautiful venue, and we also need to thank all of the organisers at Yad Vashem UK for the work that they've done in helping to organise this event. And here we can see the sculpture is almost finished. It's really phenomenal to see that. It's really the phenomenal attention of detail that we can see that Frances is working on now. And it's a rush against the clock because we're almost at 25 minutes past 7. One way that I can identify a little bit with Frances working against the clock was actually my father was a surgeon, and he used to work against the clock, and there was always a competition to carry out the operations as quickly as you could because speed is of the elements. And of course, working in clay, there's also an element of speed because it does dry out, and you have to work very quickly with clay. And for those of you who've joined us late and have missed the film interviews that I did with Frances and with Mala, you really need to know that these are two intensely bubbly and ladies who love to talk. So it's very odd for me to watch them both working so silently. In about 5 minutes, Frances and Mala will be joining me here on the sofa. And if you have any particular questions that you might like me to put to them, please drop them into the chat box now. In a couple of minutes, we're going to show you a montage of photographs so you can get the feeling of what's been going on here all day, because it's actually, we may have just been zooming out to you for 2.5 hours, but it's been an event that's been going on all day. I'm just giving you a little bit of time to watch quietly Frances work, because this is really what this event is all about. It's about, as Moshe Teller was saying us, the creation of memory. And this bust is one of a series of busts of Holocaust survivors that Frances has sculpted recently. And it's the final minute, as Frances has just been told. I can't imagine what it's like to be told that as an artist. And literally here is Frances putting the final touches to Mala's sculpture, which is really magnificent. I wish you were all here in person to see it. And just so that you can have a feeling of what's been going on here today, we've prepared a little montage of photographs so it can bring you a little bit closer to the banks of the Thames and give you a feeling of the event, and which so normally so many of you attend in person. Hello and welcome back to the banks of the Thames, and bang on time. Frances has finished her sculpture of Mala Tribich, Holocaust survivor, educator and campaigner, and it's really been an extraordinary experience to watch her work. And we've got a lot of questions here in the chat box that people have been asking me to ask, and I'm delighted now that we have Frances and Mala here. As you can see, the sun is setting over Tower Bridge. It couldn't be more London and evocative if it tried. Lots of people are asking Frances, what happens next to the sculpture? What's the process that it's going to go through?
Well, the next process is, I'm not completely happy with it yet. It was drying up, the clay was drying up a lot because it's outside. I'm normally used to doing it inside. But when I finish the sculpture, it will go to the bronze foundry in Limehouse called Bronze Age. A mould will be taken of this clay sculpture so that there can be more than one made. And then this goes to the bronze foundry, and it will be, there'll be a wax replica made from the mould. And I'll go and work on the wax until I'm satisfied, and then it goes into the bronze process, the lost wax method, and then I go through the patination process, and I always do colour my bronzes now, and I'm so thrilled because I mean, Mala's eyes are just exquisite. Really unbelievable. So it's going to look so wonderful when it's finished. Really amazing.
And lots of people in the chat box are asking Mala, how do you feel after being suddenly turned into a work of art? Not that you're not one already.
I'm just wondering myself. I haven't thought about it that way. But I'm actually, as before, I feel quite honoured that should have happened. and especially that Frances did it, because her work is absolutely amazing. I've always admired it, but seeing my own image, I say it in all sincerity that you've done a wonderful job.
Thank you.
So, you know, I'm amazed, I'm pleased, and thank you to Yad Vashem for asking me in the first place.
And quite a few people have been asking questions about your experiences, Mala. A number of people have asked, how did you actually get the strength to continue, particularly through the ordeals that you went through? Where did that inner strength come from?
Shall I tell you the truth? I don't know. It's just, I wasn't there thinking consciously that I've got to be strong, I've got to survive. I have seen books where it was titles like, I will survive. Maybe subconsciously I had this determination, but there's nothing that I can tell you that I consciously thought about. I just kept going until it finished somehow.
And a lot of people are asking for you to reiterate your feelings on the liberation. We touched a little bit in that in the film when I came to your garden to interview you, but exactly what were your feelings in those first few days?
Well, one doesn't always remember one's feelings, but I remember my feelings when I saw the people run, and I thought, well, how have they got the strength? I actually remember thinking that. And after that, things sort of took their own their own way, their own space. I was really in the hands of other people. I wasn't making any decisions. I wasn't asking for anything. Things were just happening, and they were all good things. Because once the British got established and got going, they were absolutely remarkable. I keep praising them. Most of those wonderful liberators are gone now, but the few that are still around talk about how they really suffered when they first went into the camp. And a lot of them couldn't talk about it for a very, very long time. It's only now, towards the end of their life, that they started talking. And I just can't praise the British enough. That's really what I feel about the whole thing. But there was so much happening after the war. And I've actually said quite a lot of it before, so I won't repeat it, but I know we were sort of almost in a trance, coming to realize that the war is actually finished. And then our thoughts turned to our families. Who's left? Is anybody alive still anywhere? And there was sort of a lot of mixed feelings, but I have to say that I remember some very pleasant things, especially as the children were treated really well, and they tried to do extra things for us, and it kind of all turned out okay in the end.
One story you told me was how the British soldiers arranged an impromptu picnic for you in the forest near Bergen-Belsen.
Yes. Didn't I say that before? No. Well, I thought it was in the film. So I wasn't going to say it again, but they actually, a few of the soldiers, excuse me, decided that they wanted to treat the children. They give them a treat, and that wasn't part of their job, so they didn't have to do it. But they organized a picnic in the woods, because actually that area, there's a very wooded area, beautiful around there, except for the camp. It was really very nice. And they organized these lorries, couple of lorries that I've got a photograph of, and were taken to the woods. There was a band there, lovely food, we were dancing, I remember some of the tunes, they gave us a wonderful time. And it's something they didn't have to do. And I've always remembered it. And after, you know, what we left behind, all those atrocities, and suddenly things are wonderful. There was quite a sort of transformation, as you can imagine.
And Frances, we're getting quite a few questions coming in for you. People want to know how you feel after this creative process. Do you have a special way of unwinding after you've created one of these sculptures?
It does take a while. It takes a while to get clean. But I mean, especially today has been amazing because, you know, it's not just an ordinary sitting. I mean, to sculpt Mala is amazing. She's so beautiful. I mean, not just for her age, she's beautiful and so wonderful. You know, I really admire how I want to understand how she survived and how she got to this stage in such an amazing situation. You know, she's wonderful. And so sculpting her was lovely. I couldn't actually make it look as beautiful as she is. And it will come out with the colouring in the end, but she is a really unusually beautiful woman. So unwinding may take me a couple of hours.
And a lot of people are asking, who are you going to sculpt next? What's your next project?
My next project is going to be, I believe it's Bruce Oldfield for Bernardo's, sculpting that at Lambeth Palace. And then I'm going to be sculpting Simon Rattle at the end of the year, perhaps. And I've got quite a lot more lined up, which I'm really pleased about because I'm really enjoying working.
Well, thank you both so much for all the time that you've given us this evening, and you both must be exhausted. It's been a long day. As I said before the photo montage, we may have been broadcasting now for almost 3 hours, but there was a huge amount of preparation. And let me firstly thank both of you, and also I would like to thank not just Frances for hosting our event here, and to her team, including Simon Tarrant, but I also want to thank everybody from Yad Vashem UK, and I'm now going to hand you back to the chairman of Yad Vashem UK, Simon Bentley.
Thank you, Rosie. We're now at the end of the evening, and it is therefore time for me to say a lot of thank yous. Firstly, and most importantly, a warm thank you to Frances Segelman, her right-hand man Simon Tarrant, and to the whole of the Frances team for hosting this wonderful sculpting event today. As importantly, a huge thank you to Mala Tribich, a very special lady who we have been privileged to honour tonight. Rosie Whitehouse accepted our offer to be the presenter at this event. I don't know if she was aware of just how much she would be taking on, but wow, Rosie, you have been magnificent. A very big thank you. Thanks to the speakers featured today, John Wood and Moshe Teller, and Helen Conn, who unfortunately we lost the connection with, and I hope I did you justice as your understudy. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Yad Vashem UK, who helped me put all of this together. My co-trustee, Jeff Malamet, who originally introduced us to Frances. Sophie, who has taken principal responsibility for tonight, helped by Ev and Sandra. And finally, to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you for your support.
you.